Great. Well, I think there's a few more people joining, but I will kick this off. So yeah, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to our final IP360 webinar of the series, an introduction to brand clearance featuring AdSlogans. Today we're going to be joined by Steve Jennings and Dan Bobby, who are going to talk to us about creating brands, slogans, and making adverts. Before we begin, I've just got a few housekeeping points. You're all muted, but if you would like to ask any questions or any comments, please use the chat function that's at the bottom. If you could set this to host, presenter, and panelists, we can all pick this up. The session will be recorded, so I will send this round later this week. But for now, over to Steve. Oh, sorry, Steve, you're muted.
Sorry, everybody. Still haven't learned to unmute myself, which my mother might be very surprised at after all these years. So I'm glad that you are here, able to join us today. I'm here with my very good friend Dan Bobby, and both of us have a wealth of experience in this particular area. Dan from the creative side of creating many of the most memorable campaigns and slogans you can think of, and for my part, having to clear and work on those to ensure that they were safe and successful campaigns. So what I wanted to do was just start off with a couple of stories that I've heard, which explain why preparation is everything, and why you need to be very careful about what you're doing. And the first story is, and both of these are totally true. The first one was for a company who won a pitch for a global delivery business, and the client was delighted with the line, that they were going to go forward with, until the point when, just before they were about to shoot commercials, they thought they'd better check this, and they found that the identical line was actually registered and in use by a competitor, which, given the global distribution business, there's only a handful of those boys out there. That was a huge embarrassment, and the massive investment that they put into developing that campaign, that was something that all went to waste, and I'm sure, as Dan will probably echo, that probably blew all of their trust that they might have had from the client's side. Then the second one was with a company who were very determined to use the phrase "float like a butterfly and sting like a bee." And I'm sure that you can all immediately picture who that phrase is unmistakably connected with. And what this particular agency didn't realize was that it was also registered as a trademark in the USA for all the appropriate goods and services that this was proposed to be used for. And that ended up in a very, very expensive climb down on their part. So why we're here, it's to take you through both the creative process and the legal process to see how you can synchronize these so that you don't end up with unexpected and embarrassing results, and so that you will always look your best before the client, and you'll never have to deal with their huge and tragic disappointment. So we wanted to cover three scenarios and kind of thought these out. And the first one is of creating a global brand. Then the second one and is creating a new slogan. And alongside that, there is also creating an advertising campaign, because those two share so many similarities as to what the process is, what you need to do, what's going to happen. So that's what we're going to run through today. So first thing is, wanted to start off very brief introduction to the relevant laws for creating a new brand, and everyone I'm sure is aware of trademark infringement, and then passing off, or its equivalent, under unfair competition law in all the remaining European countries and in parts of the world that weren't colonized by the British. What I want to make clear is that potentially there are lots of copyright issues that could overlap with this, but we're not going to discuss these in this particular IP360. It may be a suitable topic for a future issue. So, Dan, this is over to you. What we need to do is explain to people the process that you go through, because I'm sure that some people think, well, maybe you just press a button on a computer and AI tells you this is the brand name that you've got to use. There's a host of work that goes on before that, as I well know. Maybe you can enlighten us, please.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm very happy to sort of share my experience. I would caveat that by reminding everyone that this is very much from a sort of marketing or an agency perspective. And I think one of the interesting conversations is how the marketing approach to defining and building a brand dovetails with the legal and trademark process. So please bear with me in that I'll talk from a marketing or an agency mindset to hopefully give a perspective on how we approach it. I think the first thing to start with is a very simple definition of when we talk about brand, what do we really mean? And this is a big part of what agencies agree as terms of reference with any given client, and the commercial or strategic objectives that we're seeking to try and overcome by developing a new brand with them. I think the best definition that we stick to about what a brand is that it's a promise that's delivered to the customers or the audience of that particular product or service. And I think if you get a really strong brand for its client, with the client, what it should provide first and foremost, very clear customer navigation and choice. And it enables consumers and customers to identify your product or service and select it above some of the alternatives or substitutes that exist in the market. I think a large part of the work that we do as an agency is trying to understand and articulate what that promise that the brand wants to make is about. What we talk about with our clients, the CEO or the CMO, is what does that brand want to stand for? What does that brand want to stand for in the minds of the customers that it's engaged with? So it acts as a shorthand. And if we're able to define that, then what that hopefully does is it creates some of that standout that a brand is looking for to aid or facilitate that navigation and choice that I mentioned. The way that we, with our clients, think about the whole brand defining and building process is really sort of a combination of rational and emotional attributes. So really, there are two types or two elements that we think about in defining the brand, in that it needs to make sense, it needs to appeal to the rational needs or motivations and wants of a customer. So that triggers things like sales. That creates a short-term sales effect. That activates a response in that audience. But equally, we want them to feel good about that behaviour, so that's where the brand building side of it comes into effect. And this is about more of an emotional, long-term connection we're trying to create with customers, so that we create memories and associations that encourage repeat behaviour. They'll come back to us. They'll stick with us. They'll maybe buy more than once from us. This is a very simplistic overview of a typical process that a client with an agency goes through when we're thinking about creating a brand. And there are three distinct pieces that I want to draw your attention to. The first, and that's critically important, is getting the brand brand strategy right? So that, as a way of simplifying the discussion, is why does the brand exist in the minds of its chosen customers? How does it engage with them? What is the offer that it's bringing to the table? I.e., what should they choose it for? Who are we really targeting? It's really important we're clear about who the ultimate buyer or user is, and where will they engage with it? What are the touch points, the channels, or the places that they're going to experience that brand? Where will that come to life? So that's really the elements of the brand strategy. That's the critical first step. The second piece then is, okay, once we're clear about what the brand strategy is, we're able to then move into more of the activation elements. So here it's about, well, what should we call this brand? What should the logo look like? What colours should we apply for it? Do we need to give it any visual assets like icons? Should we give it a slogan or a tag part of the brand assets? We also then think about what's the right way to tell this brand story. How do we take it out into advertising? How do we present ourselves into the market so that people recognize and understand who we are? We also think very much about the product. It's a product or a service, so how does the brand manifest the actual thing, the service? And also, increasingly in the digital world, how do customers experience the brand like after sales support or the service experience online? And these are all aspects that we think through from a brand delivery perspective. And the last thing I think that I would say that we always work outside in. So we're driven by KPIs or commercial objectives, which are articulated here as customer outcomes. So how much awareness do we need to create in our audience? How much do we drive the funnel to create commercial consideration? How do we get commitment and how do we get them to actually buy the product or service and then come back and buy it again? So it's a very KPI driven. What I've got here is a sort of typical agency brand building process broken down into something that we would see as a commercial, so it's basis for a commercial process. And what I wanted to draw your attention to here is once we've defined what the brand strategy is, language for that, vision, position, for example, then we're in the position to actually think about what the creative brief is. And this falls into two sections effectively. How do we bring the brand to life visually, verbally, so look and feel, colours, typeface, image style, messaging, etc. But equally, when required, what should we call it? And the name typically has a separate brief. And the name development process often runs concurrently with the creative development process. The reason for that is because it's quite specific, or it should be quite specific, and it needs to then start to mirror the legal or trademark process to ensure that the names that we create, the suggestions that we identify, and the final selection with the client is trademarkable and registrable, so that when we come to stage 5, which is implementation, we're confident that we own the trademark, we own the right to use the name, and bring it to life with the look and feel and other elements of the brand.
So Dan, we're working hand in hand with you from second step in this process to make sure it gets off on the right foot and not, as I've seen in all too many cases, where we're asked to come in when it's close to step 5 and they're about to start filming and then they realise that nobody's actually searched any of these things. So, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, the name brief stage, that name brief, to be a good name brief, should include, as well as the creative requirements, all of the legal trademark requirements. So, which jurisdictions, which classes, etc., are included or prioritised, so that in order to make the brief work both creatively and legally, we need to work absolutely hand in hand from step 2 onwards.
I can see that I've taught you very well there, Dan. Now,
well, the thing about it is, it's in our interest, because if you go back to just possible, what's interesting is that the name is often the first stage in an agency's relationship with a client where you're actually being asked to deliver creative. And if you don't get the name part right, you get stuck in a quagmire of offering up names that are not achievable, or clients falling in love with potential names that you haven't checked, you haven't done a in effect, as an agency, you're now in a situation of disappointment management. And I have witnessed, although I've not been involved, if you get the name bit wrong, it's very hard to retrieve trust and credibility of the client for the rest of the creative process. So it's really, really important, self-interest for an agency to get this bit right to avoid all of that disappointment and then even worse, potentially risk or litigation at a later stage. I mean, just within that name brief, what we agreed and we set up with the client is a very clear process. We talk often about managing people through the selection criteria from the potentials, which is a long list of names, through to the possibles and then ultimately the probables. I think what's really important at the potential stage, it's incumbent on the agency to do its own basic Google checking and identification of types of names, naming conventions that exist within the category, but also what the direct and indirect competitors are using as brand names to start to do your own pragmatic sense check. I mean, that also includes cultural checks, so it's global brands without names and words that have negative meanings and associations. I mean, I worked in the cryptocurrency space very recently, and an indirect competitor of ours, which is a US-based financial services company, actually went to market in July this year with a new financial services company called Finance.
Well, that's quite surprising that that slipped through.
And, you know, you just cannot imagine what kind of agency or client process was not followed by that organisation to actually get to a point where you actually launch that brand. And if you look on Twitter, you can do it now, if you've got a moment, you can look at the desperate situation that organisation is in terms of actually trying to claw back any kind of credibility. They've engaged with their community now, they're going to have to change the name, they've opened it up to a community process to try and create a new name. And it's actually been a very, very useful example of how not to do it. And unfortunately, there are so many examples of where clients get it wrong to that degree.
I think with online media nowadays, and the fact that everyone is connected with Twitter and Facebook and so on, when something goes awry like this, news of it spreads so much more quickly, and you get people coming up with their own memes characterising the situation and what's gone wrong. And
it's an absolute disaster, because you want the focus to be on launching your new brand, your new product, your new service. You want to start to create positive associations with that. The last thing you want to find is the sheer unadulterated embarrassment for an agency or that client to really put them on the back foot. I mean, I just cannot believe that even a cursory Google sense check around that example that I just gave would have flagged some of the potential risks around it before you even get into trademark or legal issues.
I think that is part of the process that people often forget. They get carried away with the program and they have a name, they like it, it seems to convey what they need, and often people working within the organizations get afraid to try and stop or derail these things because they take on a life of their own. But what I want you to do is look at your list now and say, well, usually we become involved when we come down to the short list and start working through systematically searching those so that you end up ultimately with your candidate list, because any sensible business always has a plan B.
Absolutely, and I think the job of the agency through this inverted funnel is to try and remove some of the subjectivity that inevitably comes about with clients falling in love with a potential name or a possible name. And what we always advocate in working with organisations like yourself, is to keep 2 or 3 very real candidates in the running to the last possible moment. And that's really, really important, because if for either legal or commercial reasons there is an absolute set deadline when this product, brand, and service is to launch, you cannot then go back to square one on the name of the trademark because it's just absolutely mission critical. I think the other thing I would say through this journey, and this is something that we've learned, is that it's also important when you're moving to the bottom of this funnel, the candidate list, is to shift the emphasis from sort of abstract words to actual potential brand names. And by that I mean when we get down to the sort of candidate list probables, what we'll do to inform decisions is bring those to life so that people will actually start to see them as real potential brand names rather than just words. So, we'll bring those names to life in, signage or executions, websites, mock-up. I think it's also important to remember it's how it's said, but how does the reception come to the phone as, representative of this company? How does it sound when you actually say it out loud as you look at it? All of these are things that we will do to inform that final decision and shift gear from a word to a name.
So I can see why this can be quite a lengthy process, given all of the different steps that we're working through.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, this slide encapsulates what you're trying to achieve. Is that right?
Yeah, so when we're defining and building a brand, I think it's really important to recognise that our job, or any marketing client's job, is to create a set of brand assets which are ultimately going to drive memorability in the minds of the target audience. And the way that we think about these brand assets is almost like codes, which become shorthands for what this brand is about. And the analogy that I would use is almost like a nice tired analogy that I think works in this case. It's a set of golf clubs. The more golf clubs a brand has in its bag, the more able the more ability it has to actually drive that memorability, which is so critical for distinctiveness. So that's really what we're trying to achieve here. So there's the name, there's the colour, there's the unique design or an icon. There's even an advertising style, and often there's a tagline or a slogan. And what's interesting here is that if I was to cover up the names on this slide at the top and just show you the bottle, the golden arches, and the swoosh, and the taglines, and the image style, everybody knows what brand it is. You don't need to rely on one of the brand codes, particularly the name, to know who's talking to you. And thinking about these as a set of assets and ruthlessly applying them to all the marketing and advertising and communication is really the determining factor of what makes a really successful brand. I think what's interesting increasingly is we're also looking at sound. So sound is another example of a great brand asset. If you get it right, it becomes one of the codes that signifies the brand. So we all know about Intel Inside, for example, the ultimate example.
Yeah, evokes a very Pavlovian response. You hear the sound, you know what the product is. So what I was going to go through is the short list of how you actually run through searching these. So you start with a Google search, and that, as Dan has said, is something that he and his teams have always done themselves. And from my experience, I've had many clients who haven't done that themselves. And you have to question why, given that it's absolutely free. And you would have thought anyone would need to check out what the competitors are doing, make sure you're not treading on anyone's toes. So without wanting to blow Google's trumpet too much, it is a very effective search engine.
I think it's just to add to that, in any given category, there are norms. So as an agency, the question I would ask is, do we want a name that stands in the category by following the name conventions that exist in a specific category, or do we want to create a name that stands out? You're only going to know that by performing the Google search that you described.
Hey, now Dan, not that you've ever asked me this question, but many times people say, we want a worldwide search. So, do you really mean that? They say, yeah, absolutely, everything. And so when you look at how many countries there are, I think now officially it's probably close to 250. Out of those, probably only about 100 have reliable, accessible online trademark databases, and some of those questions. For those that aren't online, they're going to require somebody locally to go and visit the particular office. And you have to remember, of course, these are all going to be in the local languages around the world. Now, my Cyrillic isn't great, mine was not Japanese. There are databases that will do things like transliteration and so on, but you have to be aware of the limitations. And one of the other limitations which comes up a lot, which people sometimes overlook, is the fact that trademark classification is practiced differently around the world. WIPO are trying to unify this as much as they can. But for example, the Chinese and Japanese still use systems of subclasses. But it's all meant to give people certainties to what trademarks cover. And that's fine, that works well. But the thing is, when things move class, who remembers that? And the trademark rights often don't move. Once they're filed in that class, they stay there forever. And if you don't search the right class, it's still an infringement because you're within the words of what was originally filed. And the best example for that, everyone probably empathizes with, is things like hotel, bar, pub services. Those all used to be in the old familiar class 42, but in 2001, new class was added, and it's now in class 43. Now, some countries like the UK will allow you to change things on reclassifying on renewal. Other countries like the EU IPO say it was filed there, it stays there in perpetuity. So it's about knowing what the systems are and how they operate. Now, as I was saying to you, someone comes up and says, I want a worldwide search, but to my mind, I'm immediately thinking that's got to be at least £1,000 per country. So you're okay if you've got a budget of, say, 200 to 250,000 to start off with, and that's when they fall off their chair.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, and again, it comes down to that expectation management beginning with 3 and 5. Recently, I worked on the creation and launch of a new brand in this space, and I was responsible for the budget. I allocated up to £200,000 of the £400,000 budget purely for legal and trademark costs. And that was to cover all aspects of searches, but also recognising, because the client wanted a traditional word for the name, recognising that the likelihood we would have to actually pay someone to be able to secure that as a name, I put aside 50% of the entire brand building defined budget to cover these sorts of eventualities. And a lot of agencies don't understand that. A lot of agencies won't think that through. And so when you reach some of these gates in process, you turn around to the client and say, well, that's going to cost you nothing to market, or we're going to have to buy this particular name off an existing incumbent, and it could be up to £100,000, whatever, to secure it. Is that something you want to do?
I mean, it brings to mind a couple of old sort of proverbs, and one is penny wise and pound foolish, and the other one goes back to Benjamin Franklin, who said a penny of prevention is better than a pound of cure.
Yeah. So
it's great, to have clients who understand, making people understand that legal costs. We're not there to say no to things. We're trying to facilitate you and your client to have a successful, happy journey. And so we shouldn't be thought of as being some kind of hurdle that has to be overleapt in order to get through to finally launching the brand. If we're there from the beginning, we can help smooth the path and stop you from going down the wrong track in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the thing is, both from a legal perspective and a marketing and creative perspective, we're united by the outcome of the brand. So by collaborating in the way you talked about, it's really, really important. So what I see from a trademark perspective is about problem solving. how do we overcome some of the different legal trademark burdens together so that we can, optimize and launch best brands that achieve the, the best result for the client, and that ability to collaborate is essential.
So we talked a bit about screening searches, and what I want to do is distinguish here between the screening process and screening searches, and some of those have severe limitations, which are on the slide and we'll refer back to. So our recommendation, and what we've always done, is gone for targeted, identical, near identical searches in key markets, and we find that doing that is economical, and we get data which is current and accurate. We get a fast turnaround, and we find that that's a really good and quick way of helping to prune down those list of potential marks down to the actual probabilities, the candidates that are going to make it through. And so in doing that, we have to pick these key markets that we're going to search in. And so obviously you have the client's home country, and then any countries that they produce in, where they render services. Then you also need their key markets, where they're going to search. It would be so frustrating for a great brand but be locked out of a market that you would like to dominate. And then you have to think about where websites host it, which is what not everyone thinks of, but it provides a geographical touch point where if somebody wants to challenge you, they can, because it's a physical location that we have. And then, other things that you might, territories you might want to put in are those key distribution hubs and countries where they're likely to be counterfeited or copied. And so you have that matrix of countries, you come up with searches, then do you search them simultaneously or sequentially? That, Dan, is over to you to tell me how much budget you've got.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's about prioritization, and that's back to the brief, because that's where, if you remember back, we talked about the name group as part of the creative process. That's where, at the very outset, we determine all of those decisions, and then that allows us to manage client expectations from the get-go, so that we're not reacting, but proactively taking the client on the journey about A, how much they need to spend investing in, and B, the journey about getting to a sensible decision about what they're going to use.
So what we're doing at that point is giving you a list of options with the kind of assessment as to the viability of each one. So the next steps, presuming that we've done all the other relevant due diligence, full availability, content searches, etc., then we're going to make sure that before you file, you go and secure the relevant domain names, given that many people now scour the trademark registers looking for interesting things that have been filed, and they think, I'll put that domain name away for a rainy day. So that's something that you have to guard against. Then there's a question about filing a first trademark, and I was interested to see the other day that Google pretty consistently filing, despite being a massive global corporation, filed their first trademarks in Tonga. And the reason they're doing that is no one on this planet is likely to find that, apart from those who actually know that's what their practice is. So sorry, people, you won't be able to use that one anymore. Yeah, there's plenty of places around the Caribbean and the Far East where you can quite rapidly file things, but trying to search them is almost impossible. And what I would also say is you need to set up a trademark watch, because you have this new brand, and the moment it's filed, even though people don't know exactly what it's going to be, they may well be jumping on the back of it. So that's something that we've got to do. Now, as Dan said earlier, that goes in tandem with the steps to the agency who are going to be producing the brand guidelines, which are going to dictate how and in what shape and form this is all going to appear in public. They're going to produce all the collateral that goes with it, and they're going to plan the launch. So we're presuming that we've all been very happy and successful because you've engaged 8 of our services to get to that point. So now, for this part, the second stage, this is about creative activity. And a lot of people may not be aware of all of the laws and rules which apply when you want to create a new slogan or an advertising campaign. Not everyone is going to be aware with the International Chambers of Commerce, and they have a very defined and refined policy on advertising and marketing. And particularly for bigger agencies and those which are multinational, this is something with real teeth that can cause potential problems for them. And the key thing to note in the slide at the moment, exploitation of goodwill. Key phrase is that it should not take advantage of the goodwill earned by other marketing campaigns without prior consent. Now, that to me is saying you have to know what other campaigns are out there. Otherwise, potentially, you're putting yourself in jeopardy and your client in jeopardy if somebody else is using that theme quite recently or using a similar style. And it's interesting because that conveys a degree of protection that goes beyond just the simple trademark infringement or passing off that we were looking at in the beginning. And then we come to the second major leg of this, which is imitation. And it's interesting because it says where a marketer has established a distinctive marketing communication campaign in one or more countries, other marketers should not imitate that campaign in other countries where the marketer who originated the campaign may operate. So this is going further. It's about saying, well, actually, because maybe you've launched in Europe and you haven't yet got to Africa or Asia, your competitors can't go off and say, well, that's such a good idea, I'm going to do that now myself. And then for those in particularly the UK, they're going to be more familiar with UK Advertising Standards Authority and the Committee of Advertising Practice, ASA CAP, as they're more familiarly known by, and ClearCast, which is broadcast advertisements. Fundamentally, they're coming down to two key points about imitation and denigration. That advertisements must not mislead consumers about who manufactures the product. And then secondly, advertisements must not discredit or denigrate another product, advertiser, or ad for the trademark, trade name, or other distinguishing mark. So those are just some of the things that are in the background that we have to think about when we get into this. So Dan, you told us how you create your brand. Now if you could explain how and why you're going to create an advertising campaign and a slogan, because it seems to me, although there's quite a lot in common between these, maybe during this you can help show why some brands have slogans and other very famous ones. I was thinking of Google, who we've been searching with extensively earlier. I can't remember them ever using a slogan.
No. Well, we'll get to that in a moment, if that's okay too. But I think, when we're looking at developing a communication or an advertising campaign, it's all about effectiveness. Really, a really good marketing campaign has to be effective. And to be effective, it needs to do these two things. It needs to build the brand long term, and that's about creating long-term brand mental equity, and that's using some of the codes that we mentioned earlier. It's got to create future desire for the product, so inform future sales. It's got to be long-term. It's got to effectively emotionally priming the consumer for your brand or your service. It's also got to work short-term, so it's got to deliver sales activation, which is about exploiting any mental activity. It's about hitting tightly targeted messages to drive sales in short term, and therefore it's got to focus on persuasive messaging. So you effectively, to define a really effective launch a marketing or advertising campaign, you need both. You need sales activation and brand building. Just by way of indication, what you should split your budget around as a sort of a rule of thumb is 60% of your activity should go into brand building, the long term, 40% of your budget should be focused on sales activation in the short term. And what I can show you here, this is a really interesting illustration and one that we work hard for clients to recognise, is really make the same sort of point in that actually if you focus on the sort of sales activation elements, which is the yellow line on this particular slide, what you can see is that it will definitely have short-term impact, but ultimately you'll start to run out of roads in terms of building your brand and creating future demand for your products and services. But equally, if you focus too much of your activity on brand building, you might get short-term sales targets. So what you've got to do is manage and oversee the two together, so brand building and sales activation, in order to launch and create a really truly effective marketing campaign. And to give you a very recent example of what I mean between the types of activity that qualify as brand building versus sort of sales activation, I'm going to refer to the recently launched Coke repositioning and new campaign. So Coke has gone through a major repositioning of its brand around the idea or the positioning of real magic. And that is its long-term brand platform that it's going to use to build its brand over the long term. So that is the emotional connection that it's looking to do to position the brand for the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years is a typical time. So that's the long-term brand building focus. But it's launched with an initial campaign, which some of the attendees on the call might see, which is targeted towards the gamer community with the slogan of the line, one Coke away from each other. You might see the execution on TV, which is very much an in-game experience where they're trying to target a sort of a millennial audience, a gamer community, to make Coke relevant to that particular group of people. This campaign will only last for probably 2 or 3 months. It will be superseded by a Christmas campaign, whereas the Real Magic brand platform will endure over a long period of time. And this is just an example of how brands start to think about the short and the long bit and defining their activities and their campaigns. Within that, I mentioned earlier about brand codes or brand assets. At their best, slogans or taglines, the way we think about them, in a way, is like a linguistic logo. You get a really strong tagline or slogan. What it acts as a mechanism by which it really reinforces the positioning of the brand, and ultimately, to be successful, it needs to be memorable, it's got to create that awareness, and it's got to capture or convey the essence of what that brand's about. And if you get that right, then it becomes one of the assets that I talked about alongside the name, the logo, and the colour, which acts as a sort of driver for that awareness and that distinctiveness that great brands have. What's interesting, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is not all brands have them. And I'll go on to talk about why that is on the next slide. But I think what I've got on this slide is some examples of some really good slogans or taglines which become synonymous with the brand over a long period of time. So because you're worth it, the future's bright, the future's ... Diamonds are forever, or even think different. Most consumers know exactly who that brand is that's talking to them without necessarily knowing the name. So if you jump to the next slide, I think everybody would have got that it's L'Oreal because you're worth it, the future's bright, the future's orange, diamonds are forever is clearly the De Beers great line from a few years ago now, and think different when Apple was trying to clearly position itself as an alternative to IBM. One other thing I would say about these, and the difference that makes these lines part of the core brand asset, is that they endure. The organisation, the client, sticks with them over a period of time, in that they last beyond just an initial campaign. So, Orange, for example, was used the future's bright, the future's orange, for I think at least 8 if not 9 years.
Yeah, and that certainly has stuck in mind. And when you look at Think Different, which at the time that was launched, Apple was really struggling. They'd had a couple of bad years. They were about $2 billion down in losses. they came up with that Think Different campaign where they had high-profile icons from Albert Einstein, from Muhammad Ali, always think different, and that just stands out in one of the campaigns, and that helped turn their fortunes around. But later, they subsequently moved on from that, because as time moved on, it had become a limiting factor in that, you know, people then began to think, well, you have to be an academic or an artist, someone creative in order to use an Apple Mac, which wasn't what they were trying to communicate. So
interesting, they wanted everyone to see themselves as creative. They could find a hobby set for the creative arts, and we're all creative. Well, that's another aside. But interestingly, and this is the challenge with this, which is why I think some organisations see lines or slogans as optional, is that for every great one that we've just touched on, and there are many others, of course, equally that there are many more that fall into sort of marketing soup, I would call it that, which is category generic, undifferentiated statements that don't really resonate or add any value to the business or the consumer or customer. And you know, unfortunately, organisations that industries like the financial services industry are kind of guilty of this. That what they'll do is they'll use a line for a short period of time that is a generic category claim. So here's just a couple of examples. And if you put your hand over the names of the organisations on the right, it's pretty hard to see that there's much differentiation or brand equity being built in claims around looking after people or caring. You know,
I don't remember any of those.
No, absolutely. And I think lots of, because of the change in the marketing landscape and the rise of digital, lots of very successful organisations choose, as you mentioned, to not pursue attack on, you know, Facebook, McKinsey, for example. I'll come to the Google question on the chat. You could just, sorry, Steve, just go back.
Sorry.
That's okay. But what's interesting about these sort of digital brands is that they achieve ubiquity through other means. So if you think about something like Facebook, it's constantly reminding people about its presence for all the different activities, good or bad. So it's made a decision not necessarily to actually develop it. Interestingly, I saw in the chat about the don't be evil comment.
Yes.
The thing I would say about that, and that's absolutely right, is that if you're going to actually adopt a slogan, or you're going to adopt any aspect of the brand, it's got to be authentic. So what was really interesting about the Google example is that it dropped that line because of some of the challenges it had around activities when it was launched in China.
That was quite a few years ago, but yes.
And what it found, I think, you know, I'm not sure how to simplify this, is that it can no longer live up to that particular slogan because of some of the corporate behaviour that it started to adopt, but it sought to grow. So the thing I would remind everyone when they might be thinking about this slogan is you will be held to account. It is up there, and so therefore your behaviour and your activity you need to stand by it. Exactly. Sorry.
No, that's good then. And so you come up with this.
Yeah. So I think if you can find a really great slogan or tagline, it's a fantastic brand, alongside a great name, great logo, and some of the other tools that we talked about. But it's really, really important that you keep it simple, resonant with the audience you're speaking to address. It's got to be authentic, as we just talked about, to your brand, so the organization, and it can't just be generic claims you mentioned. If you can use it to create some sort of emotional connection or resonance with the audience, it's something better. And then once you've got it, don't be trying to use it ruthlessly over a long period of time. You've got to build that equity into that line amongst your target audience.
So you've created it, now we have to clear it. And so one of the things that all trademark practitioners know is that very, very few slogans actually make it successfully onto the registers. There's the carcasses of many spent slogans lying around that were refused at various times. So doing trademark searches, it's still kind of necessary because countries like the US and Canada are far more forgiving and tolerant of these types of trademark than we are perhaps in Europe. So that's part of it. But when we look at what we're trying to find, which is the competitive landscape, to make sure we're not treading on anyone's toes, that we're not subconsciously repeating someone else's work, how do we do that? Well, the common law searches that lawyers traditionally use don't work at all because they're not targeting advertisements. And as you and I were discussing a while ago, often the tagline, the slogan, it's the last thing that appears in an advertisement. So people are looking at the headlines, and I'm told that particularly some of the youth of today only focus on the headlines and don't bother reading things through all the way to the end, which is
2 out of 10 views of an ad typically read to the end.
Wow. So that kind of gives you it, and that's why we have AdSlogans which targets this specific area. So we wanted to just briefly say that AdSlogans been active in business for 20 years, but it took about 10 years of creating and building up by Timothy Foster. And it then subsequently taken on and run by Catherine Jones until it became part of Lewis Silkin with Catherine on board, I'm pleased to say. So the searches that they do, they built up their own database, which has got well over 500,000 lines on it. They also use a commercial information provider who's tracking advertising across all media, whether that's social media, cinema advertising, printed press, online, web, banner, they do it all. And in this search as well, you get a register search from the public databases of a number of the key English-speaking jurisdictions. Now, that isn't perfect, but it gives you a really good package because it's covering so much in terms of how and where people are advertising. It's capturing those things. And you get 2 fundamental choices. You can go for a basic UK and Ireland search, or the extended, which covers a number of other countries. The problem is that because of the extended number of countries, you can't be as robust with guarantees that we've captured every advert that's out there. But the sources we use are doing the best they can to do that. We track and build up and add to our own database manually. And then these are some of the prices, so it gives you, a useful indication that this is something which isn't prohibited, and the more time you leave in your process for actually completing checks, it's actually something that is really affordable and that you actually can't afford to miss. Now, what I wanted to do was just briefly show a sample report, because sometimes you show people this and they say, oh God, it's a spreadsheet. Well, it is, but it contains a huge amount of really pertinent information. So this one is an extended line check, and it tells you what the line is and which sector this has been searched in. Then you start off with all of the ones that are identical. And what's useful is it tells you which brand it's associated. Why do we use that? Because often in an advertisement, we don't see or know the trademark owner at all. We only know the brand. And so we go by brand. Then we go by type, which helps define which sort of legal sector we think goods and services are going to fall into, unless it's a trademark application. And that comes up in the media, which helps to explain where exactly you found this reference. You can see at the bottom there's a short code list which helps explain things, so you don't need to memorize or learn any of these things. If it's a trademark, it's going to tell you, the application, so you can go and find it.
I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating on that example is that I can see already 4 automotive brands use the same line.
And that is,
If you have an agency, if I was an agency of one of those, I'd be mortified.
I mean, this is one of the fascinating things about the power of this tool, that you get to see the way people are thinking, even in different parts of the world, how sometimes through various synergies you will get similar campaigns for different parties all executing in the same area. And so the year in which these were done becomes a key factor for us. And additionally, where they are, because that also, those are factors that you have to build into when you assess, well, somebody has done this, but yeah, it was a few years ago. And maybe it was in South America, maybe it never got anywhere. So those are all factors that you need to take in. The check goes on to then cover other similar lines, and I'm just conscious that we're running very close to the end, so I will spool on from there. That just tells you what you've already seen, what you can find from looking at the slides. So what I want to say is what AdSlogans brings to the table. It's unique. It's going to enable you to search through advertisements live in real time, find what's out there, who's using it, how they're using it. So you can see it concentrating on social media. Is this a big TV campaign? And that all helps you inform your decisions about what you want to do, because you know if somebody's going as big as a TV campaign, they're putting a lot of money into it. And so they're probably not going to be best pleased if the competitor comes up with something fairly similar, echoing what they're doing and taking away from that distinctiveness. So we find that this search really helps you to identify what is out there. It helps to make sure that the clients who want to stand out and need to stand out, they're not going to sink into the morass of all the other things that are out there. So finally, we've only got 2 minutes. The key takeaway points: never too early to get some legal involvement, and that starts from the point of creating a pitch, being able to then deliver on it. And recently we had the experience where someone delivered a brilliant pitch, only to find that third party had already registered the exact trademark that this whole pitch was centered around. The more time you can give legal folk to do their work, the cheaper it's going to be. And but finally, this really, the AdSlogan search, is filling a unique niche. It's the only one that is going to help you in this area. So I think from that, do we have any questions that people have about this? I see one of the questions was about costs. Well, that's actually covered in one of the slides that I'm afraid I whipped through rather quickly, but they're all laid out there. And so you'll be able to see that. I don't know if we have any other relevant questions that have come in. So we're happy to provide this service to anyone who orders the service. They can go straight to Catherine, who has been carefully curating the service for nearly 20 years now. She wouldn't think from looking at her at all. And so, this is provided independently to third parties. If you want, you can also get analyzed versions. And it takes me on to one other final thing we have, which is Pitch Protect. In that we're trying to explain that legal and creative should go hand in hand. That, it's not a wrestle, it's not a boxing match. You only engage when you need to, as briefly as you can. That from talking to each other in a dialogue from the beginning actually leads to the best outcomes. And so we have this other product which deals with various stages, which helps people who've been in that unfortunate situation where they created, worked absolutely to their fingers to the bone on a brilliant pitch to find that the client ultimately goes with somebody with very similar ideas who just happens to be cheap. And you know how frustrating that is.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of that behaviour that we see, and you know, one of the big bangs of the creative industry is the creative pitching, because effectively you're giving your ideas, your IP away for technically free, and there are unfortunately lots of instances where incumbents or much cheaper agencies or even in-house teams have executed pitch ideas, and there's been no reward for the original agency that came up with those ideas. So I think that time capture is a great idea. I wish I known about it a few years ago.
Sadly, we didn't have it then. We'd have had to have done time travelling to have had time capsule back then, but we do our best. So on behalf of us all, we would like to thank you for staying with us. We appreciate it's been a long and quite a fast ride. We hope that you'll look back through the slides, that it'll be something to look through for the future. And if you have any questions at all, then you know where and how to contact us. So thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Dan.